I am born in a rank which recognizes no superior but God. That single sentence, spoken before the assembled rulers and princes of Europe at a formal imperial court, tells you almost everything you need to know about Richard I of England. Not humble, not diplomatic, not particularly interested in making friends, but absolutely certain of himself and absolutely unafraid to say so. His name is Richard, and his story is one of the most extraordinary in the entire history of the medieval world. Tonight, we follow him from his first breath in an English palace, through a childhood soaked in poetry and the smell of sun-warmed southern stone, through battles so fierce that even his enemies wrote poems in his honor, through the dungeons of Austria, across the deserts of the Holy Land, and finally, to a quiet death on a cool April evening beside a tiny, insignificant castle in France. We follow him as he transforms from a younger son who was never supposed to be king into the most celebrated warrior of his age. We follow the contradictions of him because there are many. The king who barely spoke English ruling England, the soldier who wept in church and slaughtered prisoners in the sun, the romantic poet imprisoned in a German castle, composing ballads about heartbreak and loneliness. Before we begin, if you are settling in for the night, finding a comfortable position, letting the day drift away, then this story is for you. And if you enjoy this journey, please do consider hitting the like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people. Now close your eyes if you like, breathe out, and let us go back to the 12th century, back to a Europe crackling with energy and ambition and faith, back to a family so dysfunctional that even a modern novelist might struggle to invent them, back to the very beginning. The world into which Richard was born was, above almost everything else, a world defined by inheritance. Who your parents were determined not just your name and your wealth, but your identity, your allies, your enemies, and quite often your fate. By that measure, Richard was born into an almost incomprehensible inheritance, for his parents were two of the most remarkable people of the 12th century, and the tension between them would shape everything that followed. His father was Henry II of England, a man of terrifying energy and undeniable genius. Henry had inherited the English throne in 1154, ending a period of brutal civil war known as the Anarchy, and almost immediately set about building something extraordinary, a sprawling empire that stretched from the borders of Scotland in the north all the way down through England, across the Channel to Normandy and Anjou, and then south through Aquitaine toward the warm, wine-dark lands of the Pyrenees. Henry was not a comfortable man to be around. Contemporaries described him as constantly in motion, always restless, eating while standing, never sitting still for long, his clothing rumpled, his red hair disordered, his eyes a peculiar gray blue that could freeze a man in place when they turned cold. He wore out horses and attendants alike, moving at a pace that left his court breathless and frequently unable to guess where the king would sleep on any given night. He was brilliant at administration, passionate about the law, determined to bend the machinery of government to his will in ways that would leave lasting marks on English legal history. He was also, depending on who you asked and on which day, a devoted husband, an abusive tyrant, a loving father, and a jealous, manipulative patriarch who could never quite bring himself to trust anyone, including the people he loved. The shadow over Henry's later reign was, of course, the terrible quarrel with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whom Henry had once counted as his closest friend, and whom he inadvertently caused to be murdered in his own cathedral in 1170. 4 nights took Henry's exasperated outburst. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" as a direct order. Becket was killed at the altar. The outrage across Christendom was immediate and profound. Henry had to walk barefoot to Canterbury in penance and submit to being flogged by monks. It was the greatest humiliation of his reign, and it colored everything that came after. The story matters for Richard's biography because it shows the world Richard grew up in. A world where fathers made terrible decisions, where the consequences could be catastrophic, and where the public theater of power and penance was deadly serious. His mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine. If you know one thing about Eleanor, know this. In a century that gave women almost no formal power, she was arguably the most powerful woman in Europe for most of her life, and she wielded that power with a combination of charm, intelligence, iron nerve, and what can only be described as an almost total absence of fear. She had been Queen of France first, wife to the pious and rather dull Louis VII, before that marriage was annulled in 1152. Within 2 months, she had married Henry, a move that brought together her enormous duchy of Aquitaine and his Angevin territories to create a combined domain that made France itself look rather modest. Eleanor was cultured in a way that Henry, for all his brilliance, simply was not. She had grown up in the courts of the South, steeped in the art of the troubadours, those wandering poet-musicians of Occitania who turned love and longing and the suffering of devotion into some of the most beautiful vernacular verse the medieval world produced. She spoke Occitan, the sun-drenched language of the South. She loved music. She made her court in Poitiers a place where the life of the mind was valued alongside the life of the sword. Richard was their 3rd surviving son. He had an older brother, Henry the Young King, who was the designated heir to England, Normandy. He had another older brother, Geoffrey, who would become Duke of Brittany. After Richard came John, the youngest, often called Lackland because for much of his childhood, there appeared to be nothing left to give him. There was also a sister, Joan, who would marry the King of Sicily, and another Eleanor, who went to Castile. It was a large and combustible family, and it would spend a remarkable portion of its collective energy tearing itself apart. But in the beginning, there was just the baby. Richard was born at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, though he would spend almost no time in England afterward. Almost immediately, in the way of royal children of the era, he was handed to a wet nurse, a woman named Hodierna of St. Albans, whose own son, Alexander Nequam, was born the same night and would grow up to become one of the leading scientists of his age, the first European to study magnetism. Fate, it seems, has a sense of irony. Richard was Eleanor's favorite. Almost every chronicler who mentions the subject says so, and there is nothing to contradict them. Something about this particular child called to her. Perhaps it was his looks, because he grew into a tall, striking young man with reddish gold hair, the kind of appearance that made people stare and then compose poetry about having stared. Perhaps it was something in his temperament, that combination of fierce determination and artistic sensitivity that echoed something in Eleanor herself. Whatever the reason, she kept him close, and when she eventually retreated to her court at Poitiers to govern Aquitaine and get away from a marriage that had long since turned sour, she took Richard with her. And it was in Poitiers that the man was made. Picture the Court of Poitiers in the 1160s and early 1170s. It is a warm place in every sense. The architecture has none of the gray severity of England, none of the northern cold. There is color here, music rising from the courtyards in the evenings, the sound of poetry being recited or sung in Occitan, the language that sounds, to an English ear, like someone took French and asked it to relax a little. Eleanor's court was a gathering point for the greatest troubadours of the era. Men like Bernard de Ventadorn, who could make even a stone weep with his love songs, passed through. The ideals of courtly love hung in the air, the notion that a true knight should be brave and strong, yes, but also gentle and devoted, capable of feeling as well as fighting, alive to beauty as well as to danger. Richard absorbed all of this. He was educated in Latin, in the vernacular languages of both North and South. He learned to read and write with genuine facility, which was not something every medieval nobleman bothered with. He was taught music and composition, and he became genuinely talented. He wrote songs, mostly in Occitan, and at least one of them survives, composed later in very different circumstances, that is moving even now. He loved to conduct the choir in his chapel. He composed ballads in the tradition of the troubadours he had grown up among. He was, in the most literal sense, a medieval rock star in training, beautiful, musical, dramatic, and absolutely convinced of his own specialness. But alongside all of this culture and refinement came something else: training for war. By the standards of his time, Richard was exceptional. He was tall, reported to be around 6'4", which in the 12th century was extraordinary, a figure that would have towered over most of the men around him. He was physically strong, with the kind of broad-shouldered build that the armorers of the day could dress magnificently. Contemporary descriptions paint a picture of a genuinely striking man: reddish gold hair, long limbs, an elegant bearing that suggested both the nobleman and the warrior without contradicting either. One account of his arrival in England for his coronation notes that crowds turned out to glimpse a man they had essentially never seen before, a king who had spent his formative years in the South, and that they were greeted by someone whose very presence seemed to confirm the stories they had heard. He looked like a king. More specifically, he looked like the king that the age of chivalry had been waiting for. He took to the tournament circuit and the practice fields with a natural gift that his instructors recognized immediately. And crucially, he had something beyond physical ability. He had the commander's eye, the ability to read a battlefield, to understand the logic of an army, to know when to wait and when to strike. He had it young, almost instinctively, in the way that certain people simply understand music without being taught the theory. By the time he was 16 years old, he was already leading armies in the field, not ceremonially, not just riding at the front while experienced generals made the decisions. He was commanding, he was making tactical choices that experienced men twice his age would have been proud of. And in 1175, after the turbulence of a family rebellion that we will come to shortly, he was sent back into Aquitaine to deal with the barons who had risen against his father's authority, and he did so with a ferocity that genuinely startled people. This was not a boy playing at soldiering. This was something else entirely. He sieged castles that were considered impregnable, using siege engines with an ingenuity that belied his youth. He rode into negotiations with the cool authority of a man who already knew the outcome because he had already won the battle. The barons of Aquitaine, who had been testing the limits of authority for decades, encountered in Richard something new: a young ruler who was genuinely harder than they were, and who did not need to prove it by posturing. He proved it by results. A Muslim chronicler of the era, writing with the cool detachment of someone observing from the outside, would later say that Richard's courage, cunning, energy, and patience made him the most remarkable man of his time. That assessment, remarkably, came from someone who spent years on the opposing side of virtually every major battle Richard ever fought. But before we can follow him to the crusade, before we can understand the man who earned that epithet, we need to understand the family chaos that preceded everything. Because Richard did not simply rise to power, he fought for it, and some of what he fought against was his own blood. The Plantagenet family, for all its brilliance, suffered from a particular and almost tragic flaw. Henry II, for all his administrative genius, could not bear to actually give his sons real power. He named them heirs to various territories. He had them crowned or invested in elaborate ceremonies. But he kept the purse strings, the real authority, the ability to act as genuinely independent rulers, firmly in his own hands. His oldest son, Henry, called the Young King, was actually crowned King of England during his father's own lifetime in a bizarre attempt to secure the succession, but then given almost nothing to do with that crown. Geoffrey was Duke of Brittany in name. Richard was Duke of Aquitaine in name. But they were all, in practical terms, dependent on a father who seemed constitutionally incapable of letting go. The result was predictable. In 1173, when Richard was 15 years old, his older brothers, Henry and Geoffrey, revolted against their father. And Eleanor, their mother, who by this point had been locked in a marriage that was cold and often hostile for years, encouraged them. More than that, she sent Richard and Geoffrey to the French court to join the rebellion. She was captured by Henry's agents on the road out of Poitiers, dressed, according to one chronicle, as a man in an attempt to disguise herself. She would spend the next 16 years as Henry's prisoner. The revolt failed. Louis of France supported it, but not enough. Henry moved with characteristic speed and ferocity to crush it. And Richard, 15 years old and on the losing side of a war against his own father, had to go to Henry's court and beg forgiveness. The chroniclers describe the scene in terms that feel almost unbearably humiliating. Richard weeping, throwing himself at his father's feet, begging for the kiss of peace. Henry gave it, but something had shifted. Something in Richard's understanding of the world and of his father had changed permanently. The lesson he took from 1173 was not submission. It was patience and vigilance and the absolute certainty that when the moment came, you had to be ready. He went back to Aquitaine and he worked. The barons there were chronically restless, forever testing the authority of whoever claimed to govern them, quick to rebellion, slow to pay taxes, magnificently proud of their independence. Richard dealt with them the way a skilled surgeon deals with an infected wound, precisely and without sentiment. He sieged their castles. He negotiated when he had to and fought when he needed to. He learned the terrain of Aquitaine intimately, every valley and ridge, every defensible hill, every road. He became, in effect, the country, and it became him. He thought of Aquitaine as home long after England had become merely a country he was technically king of. But the family drama continued to bubble. His brother Henry, the young king, died suddenly in 1183 of a fever while on campaign in southern France. The dynastic mathematics shifted instantly. Richard was now heir apparent to everything: England, Normandy, Anjou, and the rest. He was suddenly the most important young man in Europe, and his father, in the way that seemed almost designed to provoke him, responded to this by suggesting that Richard should hand Aquitaine over to the youngest brother, John. Richard refused. Of course he refused. Aquitaine was his. It was the place he had spent his entire adult life, building, the place where his mother had shaped him, the place where the troubadours still sang. He refused not just diplomatically, but angrily, and the relationship between Richard and his father, never warm, slid towards something colder and more dangerous. And then there was the matter of Alice. Since childhood, Richard had been formally betrothed to Alice of France, daughter of Louis VII, and therefore sister of the current French king, Philip II. It was a political match arranged to smooth relations between England and France, and it had been dangling, unresolved, for over a decade. The reason it remained unresolved was quietly scandalous. There were widespread rumors, apparently taken seriously by many, including Richard himself, that his father Henry had taken Alice as his mistress. Whether this was true is something historians still debate. What is clear is that Richard had absolutely no intention of marrying a woman his father had allegedly kept as a lover, and that Henry refused to either confirm the rumors or release Richard from the betrothal. He was using the situation as a lever, keeping Richard uncertain and dependent. By this point, Richard's new ally was the very man who might have been his enemy, Philip II of France, called Philip Augustus. Now here is a fascinating and genuinely strange pairing. Philip was everything Richard was not, physically. He was unimpressive in person, not particularly martial, not the ideal of knightly virtue that Richard embodied. He was a cold, precise political calculator, a spider at the center of his diplomatic web, always thinking 3 moves ahead. But he and Richard found common cause in their shared frustration with Henry II. In 1188, Richard did something that must have felt like the crossing of a threshold he could never come back from. He did formal homage to Philip for all of England's French territories. He allied himself openly with the French king against his own father. What followed was swift and brutal. Richard and Philip drove Henry from Le Mans, his birthplace, the city he loved above all others. Henry, sick and exhausted, retreated. He was forced to acknowledge Richard as his heir. He was shown a list of those who had conspired against him, and the first name on the list was John, his beloved youngest son, the one son he had always favored. This piece of information, according to the chroniclers, broke something in Henry II. 2 days after his capitulation, on the 6th of July, 1189, he died at the castle of Chinon. Some said his heart had given out. Others said he had died of grief. The truth was probably both, and something more complicated still. Richard came to see the body of his father. He stood over it in silence. What he felt in that moment, nobody recorded. Whatever it was, he kept it to himself. He was now King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and ruler of Aquitaine. He was 31 years old, and he had exactly one ambition. He wanted to go on crusade. This needs a little context, because in the 21st century, it is easy to miss how overwhelming the emotional and spiritual weight of the crusade was for someone of Richard's time and background. In 1187, just 2 years before Richard became king, Saladin, the great Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had won a catastrophic victory over the Crusader forces at the Battle of Hattin. It was a disaster without precedent in the history of the Crusader states. On a dry hillside in Galilee in the burning July heat, Saladin had drawn the entire Crusader army into a trap, cut them off from water, and surrounded them. The cream of the Crusader forces, the Templars and Hospitallers, the greatest knights of Outremer, had been killed or captured. Jerusalem had fallen 3 months later, without even a serious siege, because there was simply no army left to defend it. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Christendom, the place where Christ himself was believed to have been buried and resurrected, was in Muslim hands. In Europe, the shock was profound and immediate. Pope Gregory VIII issued an urgent call to arms. Kings throughout Europe took the cross. For a devoutly Christian medieval king, this was not just a political problem. It was a spiritual crisis of the first order, the kind of crisis that demanded a response not merely of policy, but of conscience. Richard had taken the Crusaders' vow, the formal pledge to go and fight for the Holy Land, even before he became king. He took it seriously in a way that went beyond mere duty. He genuinely believed this was the most important thing he could do with his life, the great defining act of a Christian warrior king. Critics of Richard, and there have always been plenty of them, point out that this obsession was rather inconvenient for the people of England, who were left largely to govern themselves while their king spent his reign abroad fighting for a cause that, from a purely administrative standpoint, was not especially their problem. And those critics have a point. Richard famously, and perhaps apocryphally, said that he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. What he actually did was sell almost everything else he could lay hands on: offices, titles, lands, privileges, all of it converted into gold to pay for the crusade. He raised a staggering amount of money in a short amount of time, with the ruthless efficiency of a man who had already decided what mattered and was prepared to be entirely unsentimental about everything else. His coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of September, 1189. The chroniclers describe a magnificent ceremony, the new king processing from the Palace of Westminster to the Abbey with what one account calls triumphal chanting. The crown, apparently, was so heavy that 2 earls had to help hold it up during the service. A bat fluttered around the king's head during the ceremony, which the chroniclers noted as an evil omen. They were right, though not quite in the way they imagined. The night of the coronation was shadowed by something ugly, a pogrom against the Jewish community of London. Anti-Jewish sentiment was already high in England, whipped up partly by the rhetoric of the Crusade movement, and on the night of Richard's coronation, a mob attacked and murdered Jews in London. The violence spread to other cities in the weeks and months that followed, most horrifically in York, where a large Jewish community took shelter in Clifford's Tower, and faced with the choice between forced conversion and death, died by their own hands rather than submit. Hundreds of people. Richard condemned the violence, and when he discovered that some of the perpetrators had used the excuse of his coronation, he was genuinely angry, but he was already preparing to leave, and the perpetrators largely escaped justice. It was an early indication of something that would be a recurring theme. Richard was extraordinary on the battlefield and chronically absent from the administrative and judicial realities of the kingdom he nominally ruled. Then came the business of actually funding the crusade. The scale of what Richard needed to raise was staggering. A crusading army required ships, food, horses, weapons, armor, siege equipment, provisions for months at sea, and then months in a hostile land. It required paying soldiers, supporting a fleet, maintaining communication lines across thousands of miles. The cost was, by any contemporary measure, enormous. Richard's solution was breathtakingly simple: sell everything: offices, titles, lordships, castles, privileges, the right to collect certain taxes. If you wanted to be sheriff of a county, Richard would sell you that position. If you wanted royal confirmation of your land rights, Richard would charge you for it. He was ruthless and efficient and entirely unsentimental about it. And he raised a sum that contemporaries found almost incomprehensible. It was this, more than anything else, that prompted the famous remark attributed to him, that he would have sold London if only he could have found a buyer. Whether he actually said it in those words, it perfectly captures his attitude. England was an asset to be monetized in the service of the Holy War. Its people and their welfare were, for the moment, secondary. He sailed from England in the summer of 1190, never to spend significant time there again. He would visit briefly, twice, over the remaining decade of his life. He spoke almost no English. He thought of himself as Angevin and Aquitanian. England was a source of revenue, and when pressed, of soldiers. His heart was elsewhere. The journey to the Holy Land took the better part of a year, and it was not a quiet one. Richard spent the winter of 1190 to 1191 in Messina, on the island of Sicily, and within weeks of arriving had managed to start a war with the local population, capture the city, and extract a substantial sum of money from King Tancred of Sicily as compensation for mistreating his sister Joan, who had been married to the previous Sicilian king. He did this with the cheerful aggression of a man who regards any available conflict as an opportunity rather than a problem. Philip of France, who was also wintering in Sicily and was nominally Richard's ally on the crusade, watched all of this with the kind of barely concealed irritation that would eventually curdle into something much more serious. It was also in Sicily that Richard's mother, Eleanor, arrived, bringing with her the woman she had selected as Richard's new bride, Berengaria of Navarre, daughter of King Sancho VI of Navarre. The whole Alice situation had become untenable, and Eleanor had decided to cut through it by simply presenting Richard with an alternative. Richard, who had initially resisted the match according to some accounts, relented. He and Berengaria would marry, but not in Sicily. They would marry somewhere considerably more unexpected. In the spring of 1191, Richard set sail for the Holy Land. A storm scattered his fleet, and some of his ships, including those carrying Berengaria and his sister Joan, were driven toward the island of Cyprus. The island's ruler, a Byzantine nobleman named Isaac Komnenos, who had set himself up as an independent emperor, made a series of catastrophic mistakes in his handling of the situation. He refused to release some of the English sailors who had been shipwrecked, treated them badly, and was generally insulting. This was, in hindsight, exactly the wrong response to a man like Richard. Richard turned his fleet back and invaded Cyprus. He defeated Isaac in battle, then besieged him, then captured him. The conquest of an entire island took him about 3 weeks. He is said to have promised Isaac that he would not put him in iron chains, and then kept that promise by having him bound in silver ones instead. A small detail, but rather revealing. It was in Cyprus, in May of 1191, that Richard married Berengaria of Navarre. An English king marrying a Navarrese princess on a Byzantine island he had just conquered on his way to the Holy Land. You have to admire the sheer improbability of it. Berengaria was crowned Queen of England and Cyprus. The marriage, by all accounts, was not particularly warm. Richard was absent from his wife for most of their marriage, which was partly the nature of his life, but also, it seems, a matter of temperament. They had no children. She would spend much of her widowhood in France, largely forgotten, while her husband's legend grew steadily larger. History has not been especially kind to Berengaria. She is often described, rather sadly, as the only English queen never to have set foot in England. Richard sold Cyprus almost immediately to the Knights Templar, later repurchasing it and eventually selling it to Guy of Lusignan, the former king of Jerusalem who needed somewhere to rule. It was a characteristically practical solution to the question of what to do with a newly conquered island. He arrived at the siege of Acre in June of 1191. The city had been under siege by Crusader forces for nearly 2 years, a grinding, exhausting campaign that had achieved little except enormous casualties on both sides. Richard's arrival changed everything almost immediately. He brought fresh troops, a huge fleet, wealth, and most importantly, the kind of inspired command that had been conspicuously absent. He was also, it should be said, almost immediately struck down by a fever that chroniclers describe as Arnaldia, a disease similar to scurvy, which left him so weakened that he had to be carried in a litter. He is reported to have continued directing the siege and firing at the defenders with his crossbow from the stretcher, which is either heroic or completely unhinged, depending on your perspective. By the 12th of July, 1191, Acre fell. What happened immediately afterward is one of the moments in Richard's story that no amount of historical context fully excuses. The terms of surrender included a substantial ransom for the Muslim garrison, an exchange of prisoners, and the return of a fragment of the True Cross, all to be completed within a specified time. The negotiations were complex, and there were genuine misunderstandings. But the practical outcome was that when Saladin did not fulfill the terms within the deadline Richard had set, Richard ordered the execution of somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Muslim prisoners. He had them marched out onto a plain in front of the city walls in full view of Saladin's watching army, and they were killed. Saladin's troops attempted to intervene and were driven back. Saladin, watching from the hills, was reported to have wept. He would later order the killing of his own Christian prisoners in response. This event has followed Richard's reputation through the centuries, and rightly so. It was not unusual by the brutal standards of 12th century warfare, which is perhaps its own damning statement. Richard himself justified it in a letter to the abbot of Clairvaux by saying that, since the terms of the agreement had not been met, the prisoners were legitimately killed. But even in his own time, it shocked people. It was the act of a man who had made a cold military calculation and carried it out without flinching, and it sat uneasily alongside the image of the chivalrous Christian king that Richard cultivated so carefully in other contexts. After Acre, the Crusader army needed to move south toward Jaffa, which would serve as a staging point for any eventual assault on Jerusalem. What followed was one of the most remarkable feats of medieval military organization ever achieved, and it stands as perhaps the clearest demonstration of Richard's genius as a commander. The march from Acre to Jaffa covered roughly 80 miles of coastal plain, and the army needed to make it in the full heat of a Levantine summer, constantly shadowed and harassed by Saladin's cavalry. Saladin's strategy was the same one that had destroyed Crusader armies before. Provoke them, goad them, pick at the edges until someone breaks formation and charges, then swamp the isolated force before it can be supported. It had worked at Hattin and elsewhere. It was an intelligent, flexible strategy, and against a less disciplined commander, it would have worked again. Richard countered it with meticulous, almost obsessive planning. He arranged his army in a column with the fleet keeping pace offshore, supplying food and water so the army did not need to forage. The cavalry was kept in the center of the column, shielded on the landward side by a wall of infantry. The infantry were ordered, under the strictest possible command, not to break formation no matter how severe the harassment from the Muslim archers. They walked in their armor under the burning sun, arrows falling around them and sometimes into them, and they kept marching. Contemporary accounts speak with awe of the discipline of those men, moving steadily forward while the enemy arrows rattled against their armor like hailstones. The rear guard was composed of the Knights Hospitaller, the military monks who were among the most formidable fighting men in Christendom. They bore the worst of Saladin's harassment, and on the 7th of September, 1191, on the coastal plain north of the town of Arsuf, with Saladin committing his entire force to an attempt to break them, the Hospitallers finally reached their limit. Their master, Garnier de Nablus, sent word to Richard that they could hold no longer. And then, without waiting for a reply, the Hospitallers charged. In the chaos of a medieval battlefield, that kind of uncoordinated break in formation could be catastrophic. Richard saw what was happening and made a decision in an instant. He turned an act of near insubordination into a coordinated assault. He ordered a general charge. The Crusader cavalry swept forward with the full weight of steel and trained horseflesh behind them, and Saladin's army, which had been fighting on its own terms all morning, suddenly found itself facing a charge it was neither positioned nor psychologically prepared for. The Battle of Arsuf was a decisive tactical victory for Richard. Saladin's army lost thousands of men, among them some of his finest warriors. His prestige in the Muslim world was damaged, and Richard's reputation, already formidable, was elevated to something approaching legend. Even Saladin himself reportedly acknowledged that Richard was a man who could never be defeated in battle, though he added that God might still deny him victory. It was a generous and perhaps slightly backhanded compliment, but from Saladin, it meant something. What makes the relationship between Richard and Saladin so endlessly fascinating is precisely this mutual respect that seems to have existed alongside the mutual determination to destroy each other's ambitions. They never actually met in person, which somehow makes the relationship more interesting rather than less. They communicated through intermediaries, exchanged gifts at various points during the campaign, sent each other messages that were sometimes threatening and sometimes almost courtly. Richard, at one point in the negotiations, made the extraordinary suggestion that his sister Joan should marry Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, with Jerusalem as a kind of wedding gift to the couple who would then rule it jointly. Joan reportedly refused categorically. Saladin, apparently, was charmed by the audacity of it. But the real obstacle was always Jerusalem itself. After Arsuf, the army took Jaffa and began consolidating their position along the coast. As autumn approached and then winter, the army moved cautiously inland, and in January of 1192, they came within sight of the Holy City. The hills around Jerusalem were visible in the distance. For the soldiers in that army, many of whom had crossed an entire ocean and fought for months, seeing those walls must have been overwhelming. Men who had left their families and their farms and their comfortable lives in England and France and Germany, who had endured sickness and heat and arrows and the grinding monotony of a long campaign, suddenly had the object of all of it within sight. Some of them wept, some prayed. The accounts of that moment are among the most affecting in all the chronicles of the crusade. Richard ordered the retreat. He had done the calculations, and they were brutal in their clarity. Jerusalem was well fortified and strongly garrisoned. To besiege it properly would require a large, settled army with secure supply lines stretching miles back to the coast. Saladin was still in the field with a substantial and mobile force, capable of cutting those supply lines at will if the Crusader army committed to a siege, and Saladin moved to cut them off from Jaffa and Acre. They could find themselves trapped miles from the coast with no food and no way out. The terrain between Jerusalem and the sea was difficult, the roads easily controlled by a determined enemy. It would have been Hattin all over again. Richard, who understood military logic as well as any commander of his era, refused to lead his men into a trap that could destroy everything they had gained. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the personal cost of that decision. Richard had not come to the Holy Land for political reasons. He had come because he genuinely believed God required it of him. He had spent months fighting, organizing, arguing with his allies, enduring illness and exhaustion. He was within sight of the holiest city in Christendom, the place where Christ had walked and suffered and died, and, as Richard believed with his whole heart, risen. And he was turning around. The discipline that required is not a small thing. It is, in its own way, as impressive as anything he accomplished on the battlefield. He turned back. He turned back from Jerusalem, and a significant portion of his army, including many of the French contingent, never really forgave him for it. The French soldiers had their own political and religious grievances with Richard, and the retreat gave voice to all of them. The French Duke, Hugh of Burgundy, who had been a thorn in Richard's side throughout the campaign, is even said to have composed a mocking song about the retreat, whereupon Richard composed a rather more savage one in return. Because even in the middle of a failed campaign in the Holy Land, these were men who resolved their disputes through poetry as well as through fighting. They tried once more, several months later, coming within sight of the city a second time. Again, Richard pulled back, citing the same strategic concerns. Again, the decision was probably correct. Again, it was devastating for morale. The goal of the entire crusade was recapturing Jerusalem, and here was its greatest commander choosing, twice, not to attempt it. What came instead was diplomacy. On the 2nd of September, 1192, Richard and Saladin concluded the Treaty of Jaffa. The terms were, all things considered, not bad. The Crusaders would keep the coastal cities, including Acre. Christian pilgrims would be allowed to travel to Jerusalem and visit the holy sites in safety. A 3-year truce was declared. It was not the triumphant recapture that everyone had dreamed of, but it was workable. It preserved a Christian presence in the Holy Land, and it gave both sides something they desperately needed: time to rest. Saladin, when he heard the final terms, is said to have remarked that he could not understand how a king of Richard's greatness could accept something less than Jerusalem. Coming from the man who had held Jerusalem throughout, it was either a sincere tribute or the most elegant piece of trolling in medieval diplomatic history, possibly both. Richard set sail for home in October 1192, and here is where his extraordinary life takes one of its most extraordinary turns. The problem with going home from a crusade in the 12th century was that the route was, to put it mildly, geopolitically complicated. The direct route through France was dangerous because Philip of France, who had left the crusade early, had spent the intervening months doing deals with Richard's brother John, and generally making a nuisance of himself on behalf of his own territorial ambitions. Richard could not sail safely through waters where French hostility might turn a storm into a diplomatic incident, or worse. He tried to travel through the Adriatic, disguised, because Richard the Lionheart, King of England and the most recognizable man in Europe, thought he could pass unnoticed through the territories of his enemies if he wore different clothes. In December of 1192, he was captured near Vienna. Duke Leopold V of Austria had, as we mentioned earlier, been snubbed by Richard during the fall of Acre, when his standard had been thrown from the walls in a dispute over the division of spoils. Leopold had not forgotten. He now had Richard in his hands, and he placed him in the castle of Dürnstein on the Danube, a fortress perched dramatically above the river in the valley now known as the Wachau. Here, for 14 months, Richard sat. The conditions varied. Initially, at Dürnstein in Austria, they were apparently harsh. A later account describes the chains placed on Richard as so heavy that even a horse would have struggled under them, though this may be rhetorical exaggeration. He was then moved to the care of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who transferred him to Trifles Castle in what is now the German region of Rhineland-Palatinate. He was moved again to Hagenau, an imperial palace built in the time of Henry's father, Barbarossa, where conditions apparently improved. Richard wrote to Eleanor describing his situation there in terms that, while not comfortable, were not the dungeon of legend. The Holy Roman Emperor, after all, had to justify the continued detention of a Crusader king to an increasingly critical papacy, and keeping him in actual irons would have stretched even imperial privilege beyond what the Pope would tolerate. But still, here was the King of England, the most celebrated warrior of his generation, sitting in a German palace cum prison, while his brother schemed and his old ally Philip of France circled his territories like a hawk that has spotted an unguarded nest. The humiliation of it, for a man of Richard's pride, must have been extraordinary. Now is the moment to mention one of the most beloved legends in Richard's story, because it is too beautiful to omit, even though it is almost certainly not true. The legend of Blondel holds that Richard's faithful troubadour companion, a minstrel of that name, set out across Europe searching for his captured king. He wandered from castle to castle, singing a song that he and Richard had composed together, waiting to hear if a voice from within answered with the next verse. Eventually, the legend goes, he heard that answering voice from behind the walls of Dürnstein, and so Richard's location was discovered. The historical reality is considerably less romantic. Richard's jailers never actually made a secret of where he was. The political establishment of Europe knew almost immediately where he was being held. The story of Blondel was a later invention, the kind of story that accumulates around a figure who has already become legend. But it tells you something important about how Richard was regarded, that people wanted to believe a king of his caliber deserved that kind of loyalty, that kind of devoted friendship, that kind of rescue. The legend is not about Richard finding his location. It is about the idea that a king like Richard could not be truly alone, that art and friendship could find him even in the darkest dungeon, that a shared song was a thread connecting him to the world beyond his walls. What actually happened was messier and more expensive. Leopold handed Richard over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who had his own grudges against Richard stemming from various diplomatic incidents. Henry demanded a ransom of 150,000 marks of silver, which was roughly 2 to 3 times the annual income of the English crown. It was, to put it plainly, an astronomical sum. The demands were so outrageous that Pope Celestine III excommunicated Leopold for his treatment of a returning crusader, a status that was supposed to guarantee safe passage. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was well past 70 by this point, went to work. What she accomplished in the next year or so is one of the most impressive administrative achievements of her era, and she did it through sheer force of will and organizational genius. She taxed, she confiscated, she appealed to the clergy who gave up the gold and silver plate of their churches. She imposed a quarter levy on the value of everyone's property. She worked constantly, methodically, and with the barely controlled fury of a mother watching her favorite child languish in a German prison while his brother schemed at home and his old ally, the French king, plotted from Paris. John, Richard's younger brother, had taken advantage of the captivity to occupy Windsor Castle and make overtures to Philip of France about the possibility of inheriting England himself. Eleanor crushed this particular ambition with characteristic efficiency, strengthening garrisons and extracting oaths of loyalty from the nobility. She wrote letters to the Pope that begin with the line, "Eleanor, by the wrath of God, Queen of England," which is perhaps the most magnificently self-aware salutation in the history of medieval correspondence. Richard, meanwhile, was not entirely idle in his German prison. This is the period during which he wrote the song Ja nous hons pris, sometimes translated as No Man Who Is Imprisoned. It is addressed to his half-sister Marie, and it is a lament about feeling abandoned, about the sense of isolation that comes from captivity, about wondering whether the people he loved and trusted were truly working to free him. It is, by any measure, a beautiful piece of writing, personal, emotionally direct, with a self-awareness unusual in the official culture of the era. Here was the King of England, the most celebrated warrior of his generation, sitting in a German castle and writing about heartbreak. There is something profoundly human about it, something that cuts through the armor and the legend. He appeared before an imperial court in the city of Speyer, was formally accused of various offenses, and defended himself with a speech that those present found genuinely impressive. One witness wrote that when Richard spoke, the emperor himself was moved to tears. Whatever else Richard was, he was a man who understood theater, who understood that the way you carried yourself could be itself a form of power. The ransom was finally gathered, partially paid, and Richard was released in February of 1194. He came home to England, was briefly and symbolically crowned for a second time at Winchester Cathedral, and then left within a month for France, never to return. The final 5 years of Richard's life were consumed by the war against Philip of France, a grinding, expensive, complicated campaign to recover the territories that Philip had seized during Richard's captivity. John's brief rebellion collapsed the moment Richard appeared, and Richard, in a characteristic gesture that was either genuine magnanimity or superb political calculation, forgave his brother. He is supposed to have said to John, "You are a child who has had bad advisors." John was 30 years old at the time, but the point stood. What Richard achieved in those 5 years of campaigning against Philip was, militarily speaking, remarkable. He retook virtually everything that had been lost. He demonstrated again the tactical brilliance, the personal courage, the ability to inspire men that had made him a legend in the Holy Land. He won engagements that should have been lost, and negotiated terms that his advisors thought unreachable. He was, to Philip's considerable frustration, simply better at this than Philip was, and they both knew it. The jewel of this period was the construction of Château Gaillard, rising above the Seine at Les Andelys in Normandy. Richard called it his saucy castle, which even in 12th century French had a slightly irreverent ring, and he supervised its construction with a personal intensity that surprised his engineers. He designed innovations into it that reflected lessons absorbed during the Crusade. The innovative use of rounded towers that left no defensive blind spots, overlapping fields of fire, concentric rings of defense with each ring positioned to support the others. The castle went up with astonishing speed, built in under 2 years at enormous cost, and Richard is said to have declared that he could hold it even if its walls were made of butter. It stood for over a century, testament to his understanding of military architecture, and when it finally fell to Philip's forces in 1204, it took the French 3 months of full siege to reduce it. He was also beginning to show the first signs of the recklessness that had always been his most dangerous quality. The great military historian, not the Winston Churchill who won the Second World War, but a 17th century writer of the same name, wrote that if heroism was confined to brutal and ferocious valor, then Richard deserved to stand high among the heroes of his age. That slight ambiguity, that if, captures something important. Richard's courage was real, but it was also sometimes indistinguishable from a certain casual disregard for his own safety that had no business in a king. A great warrior can afford to be reckless. A king cannot, because the kingdom dies with him. And so it ends with almost painful irony at a siege so minor that some chroniclers barely thought it worth recording. In March of 1199, Richard was in the Limousin region of France, suppressing a revolt by a viscount named Aymar V of Limoges. He had been moving through the area with considerable brutality, burning and raiding in the way that medieval armies routinely did to remind reluctant subjects of who exactly was in charge. The Viscount held a small castle called Chalus-Chabrol. Reports varied on why Richard bothered to besiege it personally. Some said a peasant had unearthed a treasure trove nearby, Roman gold, and that Richard was determined to claim it. Others said the castle was strategically significant to his hold on the region. Others still suggest he was simply passing and decided the siege was worth pursuing. What is clear is that one evening, toward the end of March, Richard was walking around the perimeter of the castle, inspecting the siege works, and he was not wearing his chainmail. The castle was minimally defended, barely garrisoned, and he clearly did not think the threat was significant enough to bother with full armor. A defender on the walls caught sight of him. Some accounts describe this person as a young man, possibly little more than a boy, using a crossbow and a frying pan as an improvised shield. Richard, according to one chronicler, actually stopped to watch and laugh at the spectacle. He may even have applauded. Then the boy fired, and the bolt struck him in the left shoulder. It was a relatively small wound, not the kind of thing that should have killed a man of Richard's physique and constitution. But when the surgeons came to remove the bolt, they made a mess of the extraction. The wound became infected. Gangrene set in. For 11 days, Richard lingered, and the fever climbed and did not break. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was in her 70s now and should by any reasonable standard have been resting somewhere, came to be with her son. She sat with him. She was there when it became clear that he was not going to recover. Richard asked that his killer be brought before him, The young man came, clearly terrified, clearly expecting death. He explained that Richard had killed his father and two of his brothers, and that he had been aiming for the king in revenge. He had expected nothing but execution. Richard looked at the young man who had killed him and forgave him. He ordered him released and given 100 shillings. He said something to the effect of, "Live on, and by my bounty behold the light of day." The gesture was magnificent. The sequel was not. After Richard died, one of his captains had the young man flayed alive and hanged. So much for royal mercy. Richard died on the 6th of April, 1199. He was 41 years old. He had been king for 10 years. He had spent approximately 6 months of those 10 years in England. He was buried, as he had wished, at the feet of his father in the Abbey of Fontevraud, in the gentle countryside of Anjou. His heart was separately preserved and buried at Rouen. His entrails remained at Châlus. Medieval burial practices being what they were, the great king was distributed across 3 different locations, as though, even in death, he could not quite be contained. In 2012, researchers analyzed the mummified remains of Richard's heart, preserved in a crystal reliquary and rediscovered in Rouen. They found traces of myrtle, mint, frankincense, creosote, and various other substances, all used in embalming. The heart itself had become nothing more than organic dust over 800 years. But the analysis gave them something striking. The substances used were consistent with those described in accounts of Richard's burial, confirming the provenance. The crux, Lionheart's heart, quite literally, still existed as an object of analysis and study. Even in death, he kept people fascinated. What follows a great life in history is always its afterlife, the legend, the myth, the slow process by which real events and real personalities are transformed into something grander and simpler and more useful for different generations to project their values onto. Richard's afterlife was spectacular, and it began almost immediately. Troubadours had been composing verses in his honor during his own lifetime. The great Occitan poet Bertrand de Born, who had known Richard personally and been something between a mentor and a loyal companion, mourned him with a lament that named him as the King of Courtesans, the Emperor of Valiant Men. Other poets followed, constructing an image of the lost warrior king that grew more elaborate and more heroic with every telling. Within decades of his death, troubadours were singing of his glory in terms that left the historical record well behind. The Anglo-Norman text called the Romance of Richard Coeur de Lion, written around 1250, depicted a king who was essentially a superhero, performing feats of impossible valor, defeating entire armies single-handed. There are passages in it, frankly bizarre to modern eyes, in which Richard reportedly cooks and eats Saracens. This was not biography. This was the medieval equivalent of franchise expansion, and the audience loved it. The real Richard, complicated and contradictory and quite often wrong, was being replaced by a simpler, brighter figure who embodied everything the culture of chivalry claimed to value. Then came Robin Hood. Sometime in the later Middle Ages, the stories of Robin Hood, the outlaw of Sherwood Forest who robbed the rich to give to the poor, began to incorporate Richard the Lionheart as a kind of benevolent offstage presence. Richard became the legitimate king, whose absence allowed the wicked sheriff and the treacherous prince, John, to oppress the people of England. Richard, in this version of events, is the rightful order personified. When he returns, all will be well. The stories are deeply satisfying and almost entirely disconnected from the historical Richard, who showed little interest in the welfare of his English subjects, and who, by most practical measures, placed a considerable burden on them through his taxes and his absence. But the legend serves its purpose. It gives us a king who is both powerful and good, both remote and ultimately redemptive. And that is a fantasy that various eras have found endlessly useful. There is something almost touching about the persistence of this image, because what it reveals is not really anything about Richard, but about what people want from their rulers. They want competence, yes. They want courage. But more than anything, they want the reassurance that someone powerful is on their side. Richard, absent, crusading, imprisoned, perpetually elsewhere, becomes in the Robin Hood legend the ultimate guarantor of justice, precisely because he is not actually there to complicate things with his real policies and his real personality. The Victorian era was particularly susceptible to Richard's appeal. He represented everything the Victorians wanted to believe about the medieval: chivalry, martial glory, Christian purpose, the idea that brute force and high ideals could coexist in a single magnificent package. The great equestrian statue of Richard that stands outside the Houses of Parliament in London was installed in 1860, and it captures perfectly the Victorian idea of what he was: enormous, armored, sword raised triumphantly to the sky, the embodiment of glorious English kingship. Never mind that he barely spoke English. Never mind that he spent most of his reign abroad fighting for lands in France. The statue is not really about Richard. It is about what the Victorians needed Richard to be. And then came the revisionist historians of the 20th century who looked at all of this rather carefully and began to ask uncomfortable questions. If a king's primary job is to govern his kingdom, and if Richard spent approximately 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, can we really call him a great king? If the country he left behind was burdened with crushing taxation to fund his wars and then his ransom, if the administrative machinery he inherited from his father held the kingdom together rather than anything Richard himself did, if his death in a trivial siege at 41 left England to the mercy of his disastrous brother John, what exactly is the nature of the greatness we are celebrating? These are fair questions. The historian John Gillingham, who has written more seriously and carefully about Richard than almost anyone, argues that the revisionist critique misunderstands what medieval kingship actually was. Richard's subjects did not expect him to sit in England administering law and meeting petitioners. They expected him to be a great lord, to win glory on the battlefield, to defend the faith, to lead armies. By those standards, Richard was extraordinary. He was, by the cultural definitions of his own era, exactly what a king should be. The fact that those cultural definitions look questionable from our vantage point is real, but it does not change what Richard was within his own context. And here perhaps is the most interesting thing about Richard the Lionheart. The gap between what he was and what his era believed a great man should be is almost non-existent. He was not a great administrator. He was not a great diplomat, though he had his moments. He was not a great husband, and he was not a great king by the standards of a stable civilian government. But he was, by every account of friend and enemy alike, a truly extraordinary soldier and leader of men. He was brave to the point of recklessness, but his bravery was genuine rather than performative. He thought clearly under pressure. He inspired loyalty in the men around him, the fierce, devoted loyalty of soldiers who would follow someone through hell because they believed he knew what he was doing. There was also the poet, the musician, the man who sat in a German prison and wrote about loneliness with the directness of someone who actually felt it. There was the man who stood before an imperial court accused of crimes and defended himself with such eloquence that the emperor wept. There was the man who forgave his killer on his deathbed and gave him money, even knowing what that mercy would cost him once the fever took hold. Consider the full scope of what he did in 41 years. He governed Aquitaine as a teenager with a competence that experienced barons found startling. He led a major crusade to the other end of the known world. He won victories at Acre and Arsuf that are still studied in military academies. He survived 14 months of imprisonment in conditions that would have broken men half his age. He came home and recovered almost all of his lost territory in 5 years of relentless campaigning. He built Chateau Gaillard. He composed songs that were sung for generations after his death. He maintained the respect, however grudging, of the greatest general the Muslim world produced in that era. The Muslim scholar and biographer Baha al-Din, who served Saladin and had every reason to see Richard as an enemy, wrote about him with something approaching admiration. He described Richard's courage, his energy, his extraordinary physical presence on the battlefield. When Richard fought sick from a litter, when Richard charged at Arsuf, when Richard walked the walls at Acre, picking off defenders with a crossbow, despite being barely able to stand. These things were reported not just by his own chroniclers, but by the people opposing him. You cannot fake a reputation like that. Saladin himself, in various accounts, described Richard as the finest warrior in Christendom, compliment that cost him something to give, and that he gave anyway, because it was simply true. He is buried at Fontevraud, in a church of beautiful pale stone in the Anjou countryside. The abbey is still there. You can visit it. The effigies of the Plantagenets lie in the nave, carved and painted figures resting with the serene, slightly smug expressions that medieval sculptors gave their subjects. Richard is there, lying beside his father Henry and near his mother Eleanor, the three of them preserved in stone in the place where their complicated, brilliant, dysfunctional family found its final peace. The effigy shows him in full armor, crown on his head, the ideal of medieval kingship rendered in stone and paint. It does not show the songwriter or the prisoner or the man who covered his eyes on the hill outside Jerusalem. But perhaps that is the nature of effigies. They show us the version of a person that the age needed to remember. Eleanor died in 1204, 5 years after Richard, at the monastery at Fontevraud, where she had retired. She was perhaps 80 years old, which in the 12th century was an almost incomprehensible age. She had outlived nearly all of her children. She had been queen of 2 countries, mother to 2 kings, prisoner of her own husband, rescuer of her son from a German dungeon. She had shaped Richard as surely as any battle or any crusade. Her own effigy at Fontevraud is one of the most remarkable sculptures of the medieval world. It shows her lying with an open book, reading, even in death. It is, somehow, the perfect summary of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Still curious, still engaged, still reaching for the next thought. Saladin died in 1193, a year after the treaty that ended the Third Crusade. He had given almost everything he had to the cause of holding Jerusalem and the Muslim world together, and he died virtually penniless. The gold he had accumulated over decades of conquest had been spent on his campaigns. When his treasurer counted what remained in the treasury after his death, they found 37 silver coins and a single gold coin. Not enough to pay for his own funeral. His followers paid the costs themselves. He was buried in Damascus, where his tomb still stands. He remains to this day one of the most respected figures in the history of the Middle East, and the respect cuts across religious lines in a way that is remarkable. There is something fitting about the fact that Richard and Saladin, who never met in life, are linked forever in the historical memory of the Crusades. Two figures of such contrasting backgrounds and beliefs who found, across the battlefield, a mutual recognition that transcended everything that should have divided them. John, who had schemed so busily during Richard's captivity, became king in 1199 and proceeded to fulfill every anxiety that the barons and the chroniclers had harbored about him. He lost Normandy to Philip of France within 5 years. He managed, through a combination of political ineptitude and spectacular personal unpleasantness, to force his barons into open revolt, which produced Magna Carta in 1215, the Great Charter of Liberties that placed formal limits on royal power for the first time. John is the villain of the Robin Hood stories for a reason. He was not entirely without ability, but he had not a fraction of his brother's charisma or his brother's gift for inspiring devotion. And so the Angevin Empire that Henry II had built and that Richard had inherited and, in his own peculiar way, maintained, began to collapse the moment Richard was gone. It seems almost designed to make a point about the difference between a great king and a great general. Richard was undeniably the latter. Whether he was the former is a question that people have been debating for 8 centuries and will probably never quite settle. But here is what we can say with confidence, looking back from this distance. Richard the Lionheart was a man of his time in the most complete and literal sense. He embodied the values of his era, the combination of martial excellence and cultural refinement, of Christian purpose and worldly ambition, of fierce loyalty and equally fierce rage that the 12th century held up as its ideal of greatness. He did not merely live up to that ideal, he defined it to such a degree that every subsequent era has used him as a reference point, whether approvingly or critically. He was not a saint. The Acre massacre is real, and it was terrible. His treatment of his wife was cold, and his management of his kingdom was, by most sensible definitions, inadequate. He spent his kingdom's money on wars, and his people's patience on absence, and his mother's old age on anxiety. He picked fights that didn't need picking, and made enemies of people who might have been allies. He was, as the troubadour Bertrand de Born observed, "Oc et no," yes and no, changeable, sometimes breaking his word, full of contradictions. But he was also the man on the stretcher at Acre, still firing his crossbow. He was the man who held his army together on the road from Acre to Jaffa through 3 weeks of relentless harassment, through the burning heat, through the constant thrum of enemy arrows. He was the man who turned the Hospitallers' unauthorized charge at Arsuf into a victory that shook Saladin's confidence and changed the course of the campaign. He was the poet in the German castle, writing about loneliness with more honesty than kings usually permit themselves. He was the dying man who forgave the boy who killed him. There is a moment recorded by his own chroniclers from the march toward Jerusalem in the winter of 1191. The Crusader army had come within sight of the city, and a knight came to Richard and told him that if he climbed a nearby hill, he could see Jerusalem in the distance. Richard, according to the chronicle, covered his eyes with his shield. He would not look at the city he could not take. He would not let himself see what was, for the moment, beyond his reach. It is a strange image, a man of enormous force and confidence and physical courage, covering his eyes rather than look at something that would break his heart. It suggests depths that the legend, for all its brilliance, usually fails to capture. It suggests a man who was not simply a warrior, but who carried the full weight of what he was trying to do, who understood the cost of failure even as he refused to be paralyzed by it. He did not take Jerusalem. He could not. And he knew it in that moment on the hill behind his shield. He had come further than almost anyone and fallen short of the one thing that mattered most. He turned his army around and marched them back to the coast, and eventually, after everything, he made the best peace he could and went home. That, perhaps more than anything else, is the truth of Richard the Lionheart. Not the invincible warrior of the legend, not the blood-stained butcher of the revisionist histories, something more complicated and more interesting than either. A man of extraordinary gifts who lived in a world that gave him both the opportunity to use those gifts to the fullest and the constraints that would always, in the end, limit what he could achieve. He died on the 6th of April, 1199, on a spring evening in France, with his mother beside him and his kingdom intact, barely. He had sold almost everything that was not nailed down to fund his crusade. He had spent most of his reign either fighting or imprisoned. He had been, by almost any conventional measurement, absent, and yet the legend lives. The statue stands outside Parliament. The 3 golden lions are still the arms of England. The name still carries weight, 8 centuries later, in a way that most medieval kings' names simply do not. Richard Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, the most remarkable man of his time, as one enemy acknowledged. Whether that is enough to call him great depends, as it usually does, on what you mean by great, but it is certainly enough to make him unforgettable. Sleep well, and thank you for traveling with him tonight.